Hello everyone, it is Matt, and today I'm here to film a wrap-up for you guys for July. So in July, I don't really feel like I read that many books. It was kind of like a lackluster reading month overall. But I counted them up here, and it turns out I read 8 books, so that's a bit weird. But yeah, there are a couple of these books that I really liked. So yeah, I read 8 books this month. Some of them were lackluster, and some of them were pretty good. So the first up is The Last Watch. The Last Watch is a sci-fi space opera that is about kind of some mercenaries out on the edge of the universe. They are called Sentinels, and they're in the ship that literally orbits the edge of the universe. And they notice that the universe seems to be shrinking, finally, after all this time, and that is obviously a major problem. And this book I thought I was going to like in the beginning because their kind of like magic system is people get these kind of runes tattooed on their skin, and they give them powers kind of like strength, speed, etc. And it kind of reminded me of something like the Iron Prince in terms of like battle suits. So I thought I was going to like it, but I ended up not really enjoying it because I feel like the book didn't actually contain enough plot to carry the page count, if that makes sense. So this is pretty lackluster. I gave it like 2.5 stars. Not great. Next up, there is ADRIFT by W. Michael Geer. ADRIFT is the 5th or maybe 6th book in the Donovan series. The series is about an exoplanet really far away called Donovan that has life on it. And the corporation that controls everything back here on Earth is sending settlers out to Donovan to colonize it, even though it's extremely dangerous there with a super high attrition rate. And to get there, ships do this thing called inversion, and a lot of ships have been going missing. So in the first book, we are following the people of Port Authority on the planet, and they've actually been cut off from the corporation in the solar system for like 30 years or something. But a ship finally comes after all this time, and it throws things into chaos. And so that's the premise for book 1, and I really do like the series overall. Something that I really like about it is there are these creatures called Quetzal, and they're fairly intelligent and kind of immortal. They use something called Trine instead of DNA, and when they exchange saliva, they're kind of able to transfer their memories and consciousness into other Quetzal. And the most interesting part of the series, in my opinion, is that some humans are beginning to get infected with Quetzal DNA, and it alters them, it gives them some Quetzal senses, and adapts them for the super dangerous planet. I really like the series, but ADRIFT definitely let me down. In ADRIFT, we are following some new characters who came on the last ship, and they are super clueless about Donovan. They don't really know anything or like how dangerous it really is. But they're marine biologists, and so they set up a base to do marine biology, and I thought that could be really cool with the new setting, but I just ended up really not caring about any of those characters. And a lot of them had kids, and we were reading from the kids' perspective some of the time, which I normally don't like in books. So yes, this one definitely let me down as well. I'd give it about 3 stars. Then I read Kingfall by David Estes. This is a book that is a kind of classic high fantasy that reminds me of something like Chronicles of the Necromancer by Gail Z. Martin, or even of the 5 Real Angels by Brian Lee Durfee here on YouTube. That was the vibe that I think the author was going for, and it was fairly successful, but it ended up not being like a super great book. It was just pretty solid. The book is following a couple characters, but the main perspective we're following is a prince to a very evil king, and the prince is blind, and while he's on a mission for his father, he discovers a sword. And the sword is a mythical sword, one of the, I think, 8 god blades, and half of them are dark blades, half of them are light blades, and he finds a dark blade, and when touching it, it allows him to see. And that's kind of how the story gets started, but we're following some other characters as well, like a godling who is enslaved to the evil king, and some other characters from other parts of the world. And overall, I thought it was pretty decent. I think I'll probably read the next book, but it wasn't anything super crazy. I'd give this one about 3.5 stars as well. And sadly, I'm so sad about this one let me down. A Desert Torn Asunder by Bradley Beaulieu. This is the final book in the Song of the Shattered Sand series, which begins with 12 Kings and Sharakai. I adore 12 Kings and Sharakai. I think that book is super, super tight. It's really, really awesome. And I really, really liked how, as the series continued, the scope of the conflict really, really, like, expanded a lot. And that was something that was going for it. But in this final book, I feel like things just got a little bit too out there. At this point, we're dealing with the actual gods a lot. And there's kind of a big bad. And my issue with that is, one, he didn't really seem bad enough. And two, he wasn't really foreshadowed from the beginning at all. He was just kind of thrown in the last book. And so I didn't really feel like the actual visceral emotion that I think I was supposed to feel. And along with that, there were some climactic things that were just kind of glossed over a little bit. Like, there was this one very large ship battle, and it was mostly just covered in like a paragraph or two. So on the whole, I still really, really enjoy the series, but this book I would probably give a 3.5 star rating to as well, which is really too bad because I love this author and I think that he's an incredible writer. Next up, I read The Scarab Path. This is book 5 in the Shadow of the Apt series. It's the sequel to this book, Salute the Dark, by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Adrian Tchaikovsky is definitely one of my favorite authors. He is super duper imaginative. He's the author of Children of Time, which is about the virus that rapidly speeds up evolution and gets released into spiders. And that book, he creates like an entire spider society that is really like intelligent and super advanced, and the imagination needed to do all that is pretty impressive. And this series is fantastic too. It is also kind of about insects. In the book, we're following a conflict between the Lowlands and the Wasp Empire. Basically everyone in this world is divided into different kind of kingdom, is what they're called. And they're like Dragonfly Kingdom, Wasp Kingdom, Beetle Kingdom, etc. And all of these groups of people have attributes that, relate to the insect of their race. So the wasps can fly and they can shoot energy bolts as like stings and things like that. And this series is really fantastic. In book 5, we're following Cheerwell after some tragedy, and she is sent on a delegation to a new city called Canathus by her uncle Stenwald. And that city is super, super ancient and mystical, and Che is there looking for answers. Along with that, we're also following Thalric, who is an agent that has kind of been playing both sides of this conflict. And yeah, we get to see him interact with Che a lot, and yeah, I really, really like this book. I'd give it 4 stars overall. Next up was a reread for me, one that I'm so glad I reread, and that would be The Last Mortal Bond by Brian Staveley. The Chronicles of the Unhewn Throne is an incredible series, and I'd actually forgotten a lot about it. And so in anticipation for the book The Empire's Ruin, I decided to reread the trilogy, and I'm so glad I did, because there really was a ton that I forgot. It's the final book in a trilogy, so I can't really get too into it, but the basic premise of the series is the Emperor has just been murdered, and we're following his 3 children as they struggle in a kind of growing conflict that has some mystical elements to it as well. In the series, we're following Caden. He's the heir to the throne, and he is a monk that is sent far away to this monastery to master a mental technique that seems to be needed to rule the empire. We're following Adar, and she's the daughter and the kind of financial minister who has all the political savvy since she has lived in the capital her whole life. And we're following Valen. And Valen is a Ketrol. Ketrol in this world are kind of like mercenaries, or like Navy SEAL teams. They ride these gigantic birds called Ketrol, obviously, and each bird carries 5 members. There's like a fighter, an archer, demolitionist, etc. So the Ketrol are super badass and a super fun part of the series. But yeah, there was so much that I had forgotten, so I'm super glad that I read it in preparation for The Empire's Ruin, which is what we're going to talk about next. This book was so good. I loved this book so much despite having some issues with it. So, in The Empire's Ruin, we're following 3 characters. It's years after the events of The Last Mortal Bond. There's a new emperor, and the state of the empire is definitely super rocky, hence the title of the book. And again, we're following 3 characters. we are following Akil. Akil was a friend of Caden's at the monastery of Ashkelon. He also knows a bit about this mental technique, and so Akil goes and tries to kind of con the Emperor. He doesn't actually know how to do the technique, but he's stringing the Emperor along so he can get like money and security and whatnot. But things spice up a little bit towards the end, and that was very interesting. Akil takes up the smallest portion of the book. The other two perspectives are Gwenna Sharp. She's a Ketchel who we know, and she is sent on a mission by the Emperor to retrieve some more Ketchel eggs, because nearly all of the Ketchel are decimated at this point. And so she is sent to a faraway continent that nobody really knows about and no one really lives on, to go to where the Ketchel nest and steal some eggs to bring back to the Empire, since they're a super valuable resource. And the third character we're following is Ruck Lenlock, and this is where I struggled with the book, but I think that was mostly on me because I didn't remember who he was. So Ruck isn't someone that we've actually met before, but if you read the book Skullsworn, you'll recognize the name. And Skullsworn is about my favorite character in the whole series, Pier. She's an assassin, and Ruck is Pier's son, and he lives in the city of Dumbong, and he was kind of raised by the mythical, like, jungle delta gods of this area of the world, but he left them when he was young to become a priest to the goddess of love, and that's kind of his deal. But the city of Dumbong is in revolt against the Empire, and along with that, there are some other things. It seems like there's a new threat approaching that could spell disaster for everyone in the entire Empire. And so that is part of his section of the story. And so this book, I didn't really care about Akil that much. Ruck, I really didn't connect to until probably like 60-70% of the book. But that's because I didn't know who he was, and I just didn't really see his connection to the rest of the story. But if I had actually remembered that he is the son of my favorite character, I probably would have been more invested earlier on. So I didn't really like that part of the book that much. I thought it was okay, but I didn't think it was great. But what makes up for it is Gwenna's portion. Gwenna's portion is exquisite. It's incredible. I was eating it up. I really, really loved every single moment of it. I love Rat. Rat is fantastic. But yeah, she went on this whole odyssey, goes through like an emotional roller coaster of self-doubt and acceptance, and she's with a person who absolutely hates her and wants her dead, and it's just very, very dramatic. It's very interesting. We get to see a whole new part of the world, a part with very, very different and really fascinating history that we don't know that much about. Thankfully, we have a historian with us who can tell us some things, but I wish I knew so much more about that part of the world. But yeah, I loved every moment of Gwenna's sections, and so I still, despite not liking the Ruck part that much until the end, I still gave the book 5 stars, because you know how I feel about it. And then the last book that I have to talk about is The God Is Not Willing by Stephen Erickson, the follow-up to the Malazan Book of the Fallen, my favorite series. So this is a book that I had really high expectations for, and they didn't quite live up to my expectations, but I think that was a me problem because I was really in a reading slump when I picked this up. So I did still really, really enjoy it, but just not as much as I thought I would, but thankfully it did get me out of that reading slump. So it is 10 plus years after the events of The Crippled God, and we are actually following a very, very contained story for once. If you read House of Chains, if you know about Carsa Orlong, we are in that part of the world in northern Genebacus. And we are following the small town of Silver Lake, where it's basically right on the border of the Toblakai Teblor lands, and in House of Chains, that's where all of the slavers operated out of. And so in this book, we are following almost entirely new characters. There are, I think, 2 characters that we've met before. There's Damask, a slaver, who you should remember from House of Chains. He was with Silgar like the really big asshole who was capturing Karsa. And then we're also following Spindle a bit, who is a bridge burner. How do I explain this book? Basically, north of Silver Lake is where all of the Tubler live, the Jek, some other human tribes, and all of these tribes have really banded together because there is a massive threat coming. A huge flood is basically going to ruin this entire area of the world, and so they have to basically become refugees, and they've banded together into this army to invade the Malazan Empire, so they have somewhere to live and somewhere to go. But standing against them is a small group of soldiers. We have some regular soldiers and we have some Marines, and they are led by Spindle and some other people, and they are stationed in Silver Lake, and they have to stand against this tide. And then along with that, we're following a character who we have not met before, but who should interest you, and that is Rant. If you remember when Karsa invaded Silver Lake, he, in a craze of blood oil frenzy, he raped a woman, and in The God Is Not Willing, we're following his son named Rant. And so Rant is a half-Tubler. He has always been shunned and reviled by the people of the town. The other kids are super mean to him, they bully him, throw rocks at him, and they all call him stupid and slow because Tubler develop at a different pace. And Rant, in the beginning of the book, basically has to flee his home, and he enters the Tubler lands and goes on a bit of adventure there in the woods as he goes to join up with the Tubler. And that's the general premise for the story. So I don't want to get into too much detail aside from that. But this was a really, really fun book. I was excited to actually read something that was really focused this time. This is a lot more like House of Chains than it is the rest of the Malazan series. We're stationed in basically one spot, or one area of the world that's pretty small, and we're not following that many characters. There are certainly a lot of names, but in terms of perspectives, there aren't as many as a normal Malazan book, I would say. But yeah, I really, really love this. One thing to note, though, is a lot of people refer to this trilogy as the Karsa trilogy, and that is not the case. It is the Witness trilogy, which Karsa is kind of a fulcrum, a center point, and inciting incident, I guess, for this whole trilogy, I suppose. But he is not actually in this book whatsoever. So if you're expecting Karsa and The God Is Not Willing, that will disappoint you, but I mean, it's a Stephen Erickson book, so you should obviously still read it, and I'm sure that you'll enjoy it as much as I did. So that book I gave like 4.75 stars. It was pretty close, but not quite there. Anyway, those are the 8 books that I read in July. Let me know what you guys read down below, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.